I can't believe it's taken this long for me to do a full review video of a game by Compile. But I do whatever I want on this channel. So today, I'm doing a full review video of a game by Compile. Specifically, I'm looking at a little game, a little holy grail, called Power Strike 2. Power Strike 2 for the Sega Master System is technically part of Compile's Alesta series, which began on the MSX computer and established their place as the kings of console-based 2D shooters. But while the first Power Strike was simply the Western localization of the Master System port of Alesta, Power Strike 2 isn't a port of Alesta 2. It was an original game meant to take place in the same universe, but with elements that would make it specific to Sega's console, as opposed to a port with some features missing. Power Strike 2 has always been a headache, or maybe more accurately, a tragedy for Compile fans living in NTSC regions, as it was only released in Europe and Brazil. But you can't stop destiny, and you can't stop a man with determination, and as you can see, I've finally got my hands on one. Let's see if it lives up to the legend behind the name. Power Strike 2 is a vertical shooter not unlike many of Compile's other games. You have a standard shot which powers up by collecting capsules that appear periodically and fall to the bottom of the screen like a bag of bricks, and several varieties of sub-weapon represented as numbered items. You'll probably recognize some of the sub-weapons if you've played many of Compile's shooters, like the flame pillars that are nearly exactly the same as those in Gunnick, or these spinning spheres. Each person will have their preference, and as usual, none of them are so overpowered as to make the game too easy or unbalanced. One thing unique to this game is that you choose which sub-weapon you want to start the game with in the options screen, although you can change freely once the action begins. Power Strike 2's concept of a bomb is also slightly different from standard arcade-style shooters. If you take your finger off the fire button, you'll unleash a huge fury of bullets. The longer you've been holding down the fire button, the stronger the wave. This makes for a unique strategy, as it usually gives you a trump card if you get into a jam, but it doesn't make you invincible. As far as gameplay techniques, that's all there is to explain. It's a vertical 2D shooter. Shoot everything inside and don't get your ass killed. What really makes Power Strike 2 amazing is what it's able to accomplish on the Master System. At first glance, you'd be forgiven for thinking Power Strike 2 was a PC Engine game. It starts out with an anime-style intro sequence that blows pretty much every other Master System game out of the water, save Ninja Gaiden. But that's nowhere near as impressive as the number of sprites it's able to push. Enemies, power-ups, and bullets pour onto the screen endlessly, with almost no slowdown. Of course, the programmers had to use a lot of flicker and hardware tricks to make this happen, but it's perfectly functional and, quite frankly, nothing short of a miracle. The behavior and artwork for every enemy is distinct, making you feel like you're fighting against a real alien invasion as opposed to a couple palette-swapped squares that may or may not be spaceships. Some of the graphical effects are mind-boggling, like submarines that surface from underwater, missiles that rain down and wreak havoc on the town below, water pillars, and volcanoes. Every other minute, you'll be left wondering how the Master System is capable of doing this. If you had grown up playing earlier shooters released on the Master System like, say, Astro Warrior, you probably just would have assumed, well, this is what the Master System can do, and expected no more. But Power Strike 2 reveals the console to be capable of so much more, technically smashing to pieces even Compile's earlier attempt with the first Power Strike. And if you thought all the madness on screen during the stages was impressive, the bosses may very well make your head explode. The background is restricted to one color so that more detail could be used on the boss sprites, which isn't unprecedented, but again, the complexity of the artwork and attack patterns is leagues ahead of anything else on the console. They're enormous, often have multiple sections to be destroyed, and animate with a level of detail that should be impossible on an 8-bit console. I can only dream of what it must have felt like to have bought Power Strike 2 in 1993, just going by the images on the box, and seeing it in motion for the first time. Of course, just tossing a whole bunch of stuff onto the screen alone isn't what makes a good shooter, which we all learned the hard way with Deep Blue. Thankfully, Compile's expertise in shooting design shines here once again, with enemy formations that are challenging but almost never unfair. The trick to playing well is to not get backed into a corner, which requires learning which enemies to prioritize your fire on, and of course, plenty of bullet dodging. The background artwork is a lot more organic in Power Strike 2 than many of Compile's other shooters, generally having you fly over terrain that could actually be seen on our planet. Some of it is really impressive, like Stage 4, which starts you out over a snowy mountain range, progresses to a field of lava, and ends with you flying high up into the air for the boss fight. Again, the attention to detail goes well beyond the Call of Duty. And the soundtrack? Oh, it's good. It's so damn good. It's that melancholy, nostalgic music that brings us back to games from this era again and again. They really got it right this time. In particular, the tracks in Stage 3 and 4 are my favorites, but almost every stage song is highly memorable. It's a contender for Compile's best 8-bit soundtrack. Its only competition is Guardian Legend. So, Power Strike 2 is a huge technical feat on the hardware, and the gameplay is A+, even if it doesn't introduce any revolutionary concepts. There might not be enough to talk about for a 15-minute review video. I mean, I can only tell you to dodge and shoot in so many ways. But there's something fascinating about Power Strike 2 that goes beyond the gameplay. It's the incredible hurdle we've had to overcome in order to play it as it was intended. As I said at the beginning of this video, Power Strike 2 was only released in Europe and Brazil. It may seem strange that a Japanese-developed game wasn't released in Japan, but actually, this happened with surprising frequency in the 8 and 16-bit eras for a variety of reasons. For example, some highly rated games like Kickmaster on the NES and Run Saber on the SNES were only released in Western territories, despite being developed and even published by Japanese companies. Some reasons for this phenomenon were that games were based on properties that wouldn't have been recognizable in Japan, or maybe the sales of games for a certain console were stronger in one region than another. In the case of Power Strike 2, we can safely assume that two factors exacerbated one another. First of all, much like North America, the Master System was overshadowed by the NES in Japan. In fact, it was even less popular in Japan, as there were a mere 70 titles released for the console, at least if you don't count SG-1000 or 3000 games. However, Sega's marketing strategies had worked wonders in the European and Brazilian gaming markets, and the Master System was the dominant 8-bit console in both. So it would make sense to put more resources into releasing games in those markets, and in fact, there are many Japanese-developed games on the Master System that were only released in Europe or Brazil. Just as important, Power Strike 2 was released in 1993, 5 whole years after the release of Sega's next-generation console. By then, the market for the Master System in NTSC regions was nearly non-existent. So now, it's post-2015, the retro boom is in full swing, and you learn of a forgotten masterpiece on the Master System by the makers of some of your favorite games. Naturally, you're going to head over to eBay to import one. Well, that is, if you can afford it. Remember, games that were released at the end of a console's lifespan in relatively smaller numbers, push the hardware to its limits, and only sold in certain regions, make the perfect equation for expensive. If you want a complete copy of Power Strike 2, which we all do, and you're stuck with eBay, be prepared to shell out at least $350, more likely $400. So you've sold your sister off to human traffickers in Southeast Asia and gotten yourself a pristine copy of Power Strike 2. If you live in Japan like me, you probably even got yourself a pin converter so that you can play it on your Japanese Master System. Ready to play? Not yet, I'm afraid. You see, Sega told Compile that Power Strike 2 would only be sold in foreign markets, and so it was decided the game would be programmed to be played at 50 Hz. This is a fact I learned from the lead programmer, Gemini Hirono, after he kindly responded to me on Twitter. For those wondering what the hell I'm talking about, electronics run at different frequencies in different parts of the world, and this includes video games. In NTSC regions like North America and Japan, they run at 60 Hz, while in PAL regions like Europe, they run at 50 Hz. Just in case you've never seen any of my other videos and don't already know, I'm about the last person you should expect a thorough explanation of anything tech-related from, but the Nostalgia Nerd has an excellent video explaining how these differences came to be. What this means for us gamers is, when a game made for the NTSC market is played on a European console, it plays about 15% slower than intended, while a game made for the PAL market played on a Japanese console plays about 15% too fast. As you can imagine, this isn't a particularly fun way to play your games. Honestly, there's a lot I still don't understand about how games behaved differently across regions before digital TVs, but the only thing we really need to understand for the scope of this video is, playing Power Strike 2 in 60Hz is a horrible idea. It's already a fast-paced game to begin with. Making it any faster just turns it into a clumsy mess. And even worse, most of the songs use arpeggios, so they sound completely absurd when sped up. Sadly, not as many people seem to understand this as you would think. Even the playthrough on World of Longplays is played at 60Hz. Interestingly enough, the only videos I've found of Power Strike 2 being played at the correct speed were uploaded by a Japanese user who imported both versions. So after spending all that money on your shiny new copy of Power Strike 2, unless you're an electrical engineer and can install a region switch on your console, you're also going to need to import a European Master System. Hey, you already spent $400 on the game. What's another $100 for a console? Oh yeah, and you're also going to need a European TV. Remember, all PAL electronics run at 50Hz, so if you're playing on a PAL console using an analog video signal, you're also going to need a PAL TV in order to display it correctly. One way of getting around this is to use a monitor for gaming instead of a regular TV, if you have the connections needed to plug a Master System into one. And in fact, the Japanese person who uploaded the videos of Power Strike to YouTube said they used a monitor to play it in the description. Until recently, you damn near had to buy a second gaming setup in order to properly play Power Strike 2. Thankfully, we no longer have to go through all this turmoil, because the Mega SG takes care of it. The Mega SG has options for both PAL and NTSC mode, and since it outputs a digital signal, it can play on any TV. No longer do you need a second console and TV to play Power Strike 2 as it was intended. All you need to do is change one option in the settings. It even fixes the issue of games played in PAL mode showing a slightly smaller screen, so technically, it's even better than real hardware. This is an amazing development for retro gamers, and frankly, I'm surprised I haven't heard more people bring it up. I suppose in the grand scheme of things, compiled shooters are still for a niche audience. There is still one little issue with the Mega SG, which you may have noticed in the footage I captured for this video. It causes graphical flickering at the top of the screen when played in PAL mode. I've messaged Analog about this and asked in gaming communities for solutions. One person said they were able to play without this issue by selecting PAL mode before the Mega SG enters the Master System core. Unfortunately, it doesn't work for me. If anyone watching this knows the fix, please do tell me about it, but for now all we can do is hope that it gets addressed in a future firmware update. The good news is, Power Strike 2 uses so much flickering to begin with, it's not nearly as noticeable as it is in most other games. Generally, I'm completely against any and all remakes of older games, but considering the unique history behind Power Strike 2, I think it would be cool to see a modern port with both original and upgraded graphics and music, similar to the Wonder Boy 3 remake. For now, I'll enjoy playing my original copy. And I sincerely hope all of you can find yours sitting in a box in some thrift store for much less than what I paid.